Good morning, everyone. We're back, starting to make these lectures and tutorials for you. Know we're a little bit behind in terms of the roadmap that I put out last autumn, but that's just sort of how it goes. Fortunately, we have 2 full years left in the project, so if things don't go according to the first plan, we can modify it. Today, you're here, hopefully, for the candidate site selection phase of your case study creation. So this is the phase in which we need to look at your whole farm and use some very basic high-level patterns to decide, okay, where would the most appropriate places be to do the kind of agroforestry that I'm interested in. To help you with that, we have this lecture, and then afterwards there'll be individual videos on 6 different agroforestry practices looking at a real farm. We're going to use Ricard's farm as the model farm there because it's large enough that we could find different size fields and different aspects and things to look into. And determine, even though he doesn't have animals, and even though he's not doing riparian buffers right now, he has all of the features that you would need to implement those, since the farm is large enough. So we'll kind of spy on his fields a little bit and overlay the lessons from this particular lecture. So this won't be particularly long, but I wanted to give this so that you have some preliminary information before we jump straight into looking at the especially the it's not the GIS data per se, but the satellite images and things. And yes, we are back at home in my home office, so we've got my creaky wooden chair and I've got my coffee, so why don't we go ahead and get started. The agenda today is quite simple. This is a guide to aid in the identification of sites of interest for agroforestry practices. The image at the top is funny, for me anyway. It may have been a little bit hair-raising for the operator. That's Mott's driving his tractor. We designed our agroforestry site in Little Nagels to use a smaller set of equipment than what Mott's brought to the table that day. That's a 4-meter wide drill, and we planned on having a 3-meter wide drill. It's very, very different size tractor and different size equipment. So he could barely plant the alleys while still ensuring not to run over our fence. So what does that have to do with candidate site location? Well, there's a few things that it has to do with. Well, the first is, if you've got machinery, then we need to be thinking about that from the first step. That's why it's going to be included in the common guides. Another thing is that this particular field, even though, look, we have some pretty serious erosion going on after the tillage, and it was a very dry spring that year, and the dust cloud is rising and going away. That's been indicative of the fact that that field has an aspect. The direction that the slope faces is sort of west-southwest, depending on where you're standing in the field. So it's really hot and quite dry as well because of where it sits in the landscape. It's not receiving water from higher up. Those trees behind in the background there, not the far background, I guess it's more like the middle ground, those poplars and everything, there is the highest point. So we don't have a lot of water flowing through the landscape and coming into this particular field. So you combine the aspect, the direction that the hill faces, with the fact that it's situated high in the landscape, relatively speaking. There's higher summits around the whole valley, but in terms of this particular location, there's not a lot of water moving through it either. So it was a good candidate site actually for the successional agroforestry project that we wanted to do, in that it's warm and not wet, so we could get away with planting some of these borderline productive species in our context. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to be looking at today during these lectures and these tutorials, is how do you kind of balance these and weigh these different aspects. Now, before we jump into it, of course, I can't answer everybody's questions. You're not here, so I'm going to have to make some assumptions. Some of this is going to be a bit more broad, but hopefully this gives you enough food for thought so that when you reach out and you want to do a one-on-one with me and you show me some of the work that you've already done, and maybe you're struggling a bit to find candidate sites, or you've already picked out a few and you're not quite sure, that then we have a common kind of language and understanding about what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and get into this. The index for today, we've got this introduction, just finished that up. We're going to talk about what a candidate site is. What kind refers to what kind of agroforestry are you doing? And then we're going to break that up into agroforestry practices that typically take place whether in a field or between fields. Then we get into the common guidelines. I couldn't really fit everything on this fancy template that Google gave me, so I had to shorten the headings. And then, of course, there's some next steps, which everybody hates to hear that phrase, next steps, but I'll just kind of leave it the same. And one less thing I need to edit and make, spend too much time making it pixel perfect. So let's back up just a little bit before we get into it and think about where we are in this process. We're still in the what kind and where phase of the case study creation. You've done your why agroforestry. Actually, that should be deleted. It says current section above that. So here's a draft, error that I made. I didn't see that. Just copied this from the old slideshow. You're kind of wrapped up with why agroforestry. We've got your goals down. That is influencing the what kind and where. And at this point, what we really need to do is combine those two things. When you first started doing the global, regional, neighborhood, and local analyses, zooming into your farm, we could set aside the why agroforestry for the most part, pull in a little bit of detail if you already know what you're going to do, like you've got a horticultural business. That's going to help determine the scale, the scope of those maps that you did on a regional basis because of your market access and this kind of thing. So you did have a little bit of that incorporation, but less than you will now, because we really have to pull in the why in order to identify those candidate sites. Where this does differ from the last lecture that used this template, I did brighten up the background a bit. I like it a little bit more. It was a bit depressing how dark the first one was. It's been such a dark winter, we don't have any snow. The design phase here, this third part of the case study, we're going to be kind of pulling elements from that direction too now into this candidate site development, because we need to overlay certain patterns from the design phase, such as how large should headlands be, what are the basic guidelines for incorporating machines into agroforestry systems. There are a few of these design aspects that we have to pull into this. So we're actually bringing different things in still in the second section, but I wanted to step back and show you where we are in the process and how this process, although I've got it 1, 2, 3, 4, is a constant iterative process. You have to go back and forth, forward and back, round and about, kind of staying within the lines for the most part, but you really, to do a good agroforestry system, you have to have a dialogue between why, what kind of thing am I thinking about, what are the design things, and then you have to go back and tinker a little bit, and then finally you get down to having a case study. So these 4 stages are rather loose, but they are useful for centering us on a few different steps along the way. Candidate site selection. What's a candidate site? Well, we've already talked, first of all, about why. What you're trying to achieve is clearly going to influence the kind of site that you need. So that's a photograph of some cattle grazing at a biodynamic farm just outside of Helsinki. That's a new subsidy that came through. It's a new thing that's supported to kind of blend that edge a bit better between forest and field, which is usually like this. I rant about this all the time, is that one reason why we typically don't like trees so much is that we're constantly looking at scenarios where you've got, relatively mature or mature trees, and then you've got annual production right next to each other, and of course it doesn't match. So it's really nice to see that they're recognizing that this edge effect is really important, and they're finding a way, at least from the forestry side and the agricultural side, to where can we meet in the middle and use animals to help reinvigorate biodiversity. So we could spend all day talking about silvopasture, about cattle grazing, or any animals really grazing on woody species. But what you want to do and why you want to do it is going to be really important. You've already worked on that, so we're good. Then, of course, what kind of agroforestry practice is going to get you to your farm's goals? That's super important. I kind of touched on this already. You won't situate this really experimental site, as it says there in the text, just anywhere, right? Okay, so this field we already talked about has this really warm aspect. The microclimate there lends itself to this. And then you also have its position relative to a source of irrigation water. But that source of irrigation water, if you had the exact same pump and you had the exact same budget for the irrigation system, you could have placed this trial field in a few other locations, in a circle more or less around that irrigation source, okay? And when you did that, you would totally change, not necessarily the soil type, it's mostly still going to be clay loam, but when you change the aspect, the degree of slope, and a few other parameters, like the size and the shape, in particular, especially the shape of the landform, then you would have a very different expression of the very same thing. And so you could still do a successional agroforestry project on a north or northeast facing slope, but the species selection, the density, and some of those goals would have to change if that's the only spot you have. So this is the kind of process that we need to help you with, to think about where it makes the best sense to do a case study. Because what we really would like to do is put the best foot forward with agroforestry. And that means putting it in a place where it's likely to succeed. And so our kid, she's 6 months old now, and she's having a good time. Hopefully you don't hear too much of that in the background. And then third, we've got these common guidelines, and there are some things that you need to think about, regardless of the kind of practice that you have, that unite all of this. So just because agroforestry is a very diverse set or a family of practices doesn't mean that someone doing silvopasture or someone doing silvopasture don't have things to learn from each other. And as I've stressed before in other videos and comments, very often I personally think that you can learn a lot more by talking about things that are quite different from yourself, because then you're focused on what brings you together rather than on the minutia little details that you may or may not agree with the other person on. And then you get bogged down into little arguments about, well, details rather than the whole pattern. So it's good to have this diversity of farmers on board who can engage with each other on the topic of agroforestry in Finland. And then they kind of work on their niches, not completely separately. Many of you have the same enterprises, but to do so without having to get so focused on how you're managing every last aspect of things, which is so easy to do if you compare yourself, always apples to apples. Sometimes apples to oranges helps a lot. So now this is a good time to talk about the diversity, not just of the kind of enterprises that you have on your farm, but the fact that farms are situated within ecosystems. So this is a slide from an old lecture that I just haven't been able to finish because it's like 4 or 5 hours or something like this altogether, which is going to take you from understanding at the top something about the hemiboreal, nemoral, we had that as well, this nemoral ecosystem, boreal ecosystem. What is that? What is that like? What is that like in southern Finland? And then we talk about the landscape which your farm is situated on before agriculture, and hopefully not going so far back that the land has changed because of glacial rebound so much that it's unrecognizable, but trying to consider the fact that you have a slice of this larger biome and you have a slice of this larger ecosystem. And what that means is that you've got a mosaic of habitats within the whole under your management. And so what that means is that the agroforestry practices or the farming practices should kind of reflect the substrate that you're working with. Now, that substrate has been changed quite a lot during what I call the historical conversion to agriculture. So this is the history and culture side. What has happened in this place to make these changes, and how has that altered the landscape? So in particular, ditching, so digging drainage ditches in particular. That's usually what else to use with a ditch for, especially in Finland. No one's typically moving water around to fill stuff with more water. But anyway, that actually changes the landscape. And even if you start to backfill some of those ditches and to plug them up, it's never completely put back the way that it was once you start altering the landform, which is one reason why we haven't talked about like digging water harvesting swales or really altering the landform at all except very slightly with some planting mound conversation in one of the WhatsApp chats for a while there. Yeah, so you have this historical conversion to agriculture. What does the landscape look today? That's contemporary agriculture. And so you have sometimes a mismatch, though, between the underlying substrate from what the landscape was and the way the ecosystem works, and all of these ecosystem services that were being generated by life in that area that now you manage. And contemporary agriculture generally reduces those services down to a minimum, and we expand the things that we want. And what happens when you do that and you displace the service provision of organisms and sets of organisms, it means that then you are responsible for providing that service to the plants. Now, it's not always a one-for-one trade-off. It's not like you can completely always rely upon natural ecosystem processes to allow you to have a profitable farm. There is a lot to be said about human input, human management, and moving things around, which is one thing we're really good at doing. But it is to say that we've lost a lot of those services. And at the end of the day, if you want to change your farm, you have many paths, which is why the arrow coming from contemporary agriculture actually splits into three. And this just is not, I'm not going to give you three different things. I'll give you one, which is, do you want to aim for a future that is an agro ecosystem so that you blend through a design process, kind of like what we're doing today, all of these different elements together to move your farm back into something closer to nature? Or do you go a different route? So there are other routes you could take. Agroecology, which agroforestry fits in really well with, doesn't have to. You can practice agroforestry without agroecology. Doesn't function quite as well, I don't think, and you lose a lot of the potential benefits. But you have other options, and so why would you choose to do agroforestry? Well, because forests want to grow here, is the sum of this slide, is that forests want to grow here. Now, not every space in Finland was always covered by a dense canopy. You have different habitats. But we can study that, and we can adapt the integration, the purposeful, deliberate integration of woody species into these different habitats that are on your farm to help you move towards your goals. So this was just a step back to say that, in this image, what I've done is taken, was it 3, 6, 9 habitat tiles and made it's not really a mosaic anymore at this point, but it's a small mosaic of a landscape. That's one slice, and so we have right now 6 different farms in the project, and we're hoping to have probably at least 6 or 7 more in the second agroforestry design team. Each one of you has a different subsection of this broader ecosystem. And some of you have landscapes that also include urban elements, all right? So, that's something that's noticeably absent from this graphic. I don't have any urbanization in here. This is a rural setting. I can't draw it all. But you see what I mean, is that your site level ecological history, your site's history and culture, your needs are going to be reflective of where you are in that landscape and its connection to deeper time. So when you think about candidate site location, the importance of this slide is that you have not just what's contemporary, what's taking place now. You have all of this other history there that goes even before people were really farming the land, that we can pull into it and say, what's really going to work here? What is nature trying to tell us? What do we need? And how do we bring those together in a good candidate site for agroforestry? How can we bring those trees back to perform ecosystem services in relationship to other management changes on the farm? That's a 5-hour lecture and hopefully less than 30 minutes. Now, what kind of agroforestry you want to do, most of you have already chosen this, all right? So you kind of know this. We don't have to go into too much detail. I put this here because it's got the 6 different practices that we're going to look at. So within fields, we're going to be looking at silvoarable and then silvopasture and a couple different expressions of those. There will be individual tutorials on those practices, looking at maps, images, and talking about different considerations and applying some of the common guides, which is down there at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, some of those common guides. but we're also going to apply some more specific guides as well. So we don't need to muddle all of the practices up if there's something that's maybe a bit more specific. Then between fields, ecosystem services, hedgerows, windbreaks, riparian buffers, each one of those is going to have its own little micro analysis as well about how to choose the candidate site for that. That's a bit easier in some sense because, well, the main goal of them is generally to provide a service to everything else, which means that the planning isn't quite as in depth when it comes to the economics because, for example, with a windbreak, you're going to get a beneficial impact on the crops that are the target, right? The ones you want to nurse along by having less wind there, or the animals. We have some percentages and some guesses that you can make, rules of thumb about how that benefit translates into yield or daily average daily gain on an animal, but you can't directly measure that before doing it necessarily. There are things you can do to give a better estimate, but it's still something that you can't get into the same level of detail that you could with alley cropping, right? Or with production of fodder in a wood pasture or something like this. So those are the 6 that we're going to do. Those are the examples. Please remember that there's going to be so much other context-specific changes to this that I can't provide at this stage, at least. I can't provide the answer to everything, but hopefully what you'll get is enough. And before we move on, the text, don't want to really read it, but the headings, boxy but good. Everything is just thrown into a box here because this is an adaptation of what was put in a Microsoft Word table, basically. And that Microsoft Word table is useful for policy, but conveying that information to people who are relatively new to agroforestry or in any kind of presentation, just text upon text isn't so nice. So that's why everything's in a box. Just like the design process, these things are a lot more fluid than boxes allow them to be. But the boxes are still useful. They're still useful because they guide you back to the main thing that you're trying to do without having concrete goals. And if you're just, oh, everything's great, I'll just do whatever I want, your system is not going to have any direction. It's not going to have any purpose. You can't weigh different options because everything just feels great, man. Like, oh, I would love it to be birds and bats and bees. And well, what about the worms and flowers and nature? And at the end of the day, you got to get back to the fact that you're farming and how is this new system going to interact with my existing systems and provide something perhaps new to help my farm as a business. So that's why the boxes are useful. So feel free to be a bit more fluid about what you want to do and how it might look. But at the end of the day, the boxes are useful. Categories can be useful. And then forests, we won't generally at all talk about agroforestry and forests in this project unless you really want to. It just wasn't something that we decided we wanted to do, that we wanted to get into. And also, to be honest, the design side is, I think, a lot less emphasized or possible in forestry than in agriculture. In agriculture, we have more freedom to choose where we put things. We don't have giant boulders in the middle of our forests, in our fields, or if you do, they're easy to get around. It's a very different kind of thing. And management, though, is where, agroforestry and forests and agroforestry in agricultural settings comes together. Management matters in both places a lot. And management in forestry, I think, matters even more because it's a very different kind of planning process than what you're going to get with these. Let's look at the in-field practices briefly. They're all generally production-oriented, all right? So you're expecting that this system produces something that you can measure in addition to all of the ecosystem services, in addition to everything else that bringing the trees does for the other things that are taking place in the system. So silvo-arable, silvo-horticultural systems we're just combining woody plants in with generally annual or biennial crops. They can be planted with machines, they can be planted by hand, but in general, what you see is what you get. Like we've got a field on the left that has a couple trees around the edge. But then what we've done is just converted that to alley cropping by sticking a few trees at a regular interval into the field itself. And so now we have these spaces that look like little niggles. It's pretty straightforward. They don't always have to be in straight rows. We'll talk about that later. They definitely can follow the lay of the land better. But in order to make a little thumbnail sketch of what silvoarable is, I just made it as simple as possible. And that's what these are meant to be. They're just meant to be thumbnail sketches, really small images that say, okay, I have no idea what this thing is. Oh, it's trees and fields. What does that look like? Most people can kind of generate a mental image from that starting point now about what silvoarable is. Silvopasture is when we're combining outside of forests, animals and trees. We've got two different scenarios running down in here. On the left-hand side, you've got a monoculture orchard of some sort, and then that's being converted into a diversified meadow orchard. You can see how the trees and the shrubs have changed color a little bit, and they're not all just the same anymore. So we have a diversity of different kind of trees and shrubs, which is going to diversify our production capacity, but also maybe provide ecosystem services or benefits to the other kind of trees. They could serve as cover crops, nurse trees. You use your imagination, but also, of course, animals can be integrated into here too. And the fencing, of course, is your biggest thing. You got to get really good with fencing, and also get really good training the animals to the hot wire, because almost always we're going to be talking about portable electric fencing of some sort with permanent stock fencing generally on the edges of different kind of plots. But internally within an orchard or something, you're going to be talking about temporary fencing, which is quite sophisticated these days. And then the one that's just grass, there's a meadow, there are no trees. And then on the right hand side, I've thrown in some trees and make it a little bit less a little bit less rigid, that like both the orchard and the alley cropping scenario, the trees are a little bit wonky in their shape. They're sort of flowing there. Silvopasture is probably the most applicable agroforestry practice in Finland outside of forests. And then even in forests, it's forest grazing. That's the easiest thing to do, is bring an animal that can eat these trees and shrubs or the vegetation that's growing underneath them, and create a synergy, which is also easier to measure because you're creating an appreciating asset. Hate to call animals that, but appreciating asset in the animal versus depreciating asset in a brush cutter or something like this. So there are ways to use animals and trees together because they're both also perennial. I think I touched on that in another lecture, is that animals, other than some kinds of chickens, poultry generally, they're not perennial. They could be. You could keep an egg-laying hen around for a while, but very often you don't keep them very long, or they're short-lived perennials. But they work really well together. Lastly, of course, you can integrate animals into your silvoarable type systems, and you probably should consider doing that. With your crop rotation, you've got crop residues, you've got cover crops, and again, you can decide to use either an appreciating asset like an animal, or you could use a depreciating asset like a tractor and a mower, flail mower, a roller crimper, whatever it is, to manage that biomass. Or you could pass it through animals and you get a win-win, because they convert that insight, deposit it onto the field, and they move on. And they also deposit a lot of good microbiology as well as they do that. Your tractor, unless you hook up a sprayer and you're dumping out some kind of compost tea, compost extract, or some other kind of biological inoculant, you don't get that. But that just comes naturally with the territory of having animals. So that's in fields. They're generally production oriented. They don't have to be. You can do agroforestry practices that are not production oriented inside your fields, but usually, since these are the spaces that are making revenue for your farm, you dedicate new systems that also produce revenue directly. Between fields, hedgerows, windbreaks, riparian zones. At the top, you've got hedgerows that have been planted along the edge of the field. So if you're not comfortable putting trees inside the field and having to think about all of that, very often we can see a lot of benefits from keeping the woody species on the edges, leaving plenty of room for maneuver for all your different equipment, and also bringing in this idea that the trees on the edges, depending on the species and what you want them to do, they have a radius around them which they're positively impacting by those ecosystem services that they create. So sometimes some fields are so large that you're not going to have a very strong signal from that service provider getting into the middle of the field. And that's where you might want to consider putting in windbreaks or hedgerows or even riparian zones sometimes, more into the field so you get better functional connectivity between those perennial landscapes while leaving an area dedicated to annual production, or to even, it could also be this, you could replace that grain with grass. That could be a meadow or something like this, or a field that you're going to do hay production or silage production on. Like you want to have this strong signal reaching the entirety coverage of your annual production. So hedgerows are really good for that. The windbreaks in Finland, the current subsidy system would want the windbreaks to be no wider than 2 meters wide. That's useful, better than none. But as we'll see when we do the mini lecture on windbreaks, 2 meters isn't giving you much room. It's not doing very much in terms of a windbreak. Yes, it can help if you have no windbreak, but we've known for a solid century now how to design windbreaks. They're not also just breaking wind, they're also doing a lot for impacting the precipitation flow through the landscape. So it's less obvious sometimes with rain. So when we have precipitation in the form of rain, the windbreaks, if it's a windy area, they can really significantly change where you've got kind of small micro rain shadows. But it's more obvious in the winter with snowdrop, and you can set these up for where you would like to increase deposition of snow. A lot of that work has been done in North America because we have these plains states, and then also in Canada with the provinces, the plains provinces. You have these wide open areas that are prairie, and people were kind of struggling with how do they control snow and capture some of that moisture because they're low rainfall environments. It's not exactly the same situation in Finland. We have a different precipitation pattern. We're in a different climate. But the idea that you can use trees as living infrastructure for changing the distribution of snow on your farm and how that accumulates over the winter is certainly something that we should consider. You can't ignore it because they're going to do that. If you plant a windbreak, it's going to alter the way that snow accumulates on your farm. So good to know. Riparian zones, on the left-hand side, you've got an example where we've got bare ground, that's that brown color, and there's a lot of space on the bottom right-hand corner between maybe some berry bushes or something like this. And then you have the stream, and then there's kind of a very basic, not very structurally diverse riparian zone along that little stream there. And there's a little ditch too. We've got a little ditch, an open ditch, not drainage tile. It's an open ditch. And then we've converted that with agroecological processes and agroforestry on the right-hand side, where you can see now there are trees in the fields. We have a different crop rotation. We've got green living cover. You've got even, here, this is a green yellow. You've got a cover crop that is growing up after the wheat perhaps has been harvested. On the other side, you've got some widely spaced rows of trees that are helping break up the landscape. And then along the riparian zone, it's greener, more diverse, and you have stages of perennial interception of runoff going into that riparian zone. So riparian zones are a bit more complicated. Yeah, they can be quite complicated, but the point here is that these are going to be a lot less regular than even your windbreaks, or especially your windbreak, sorry, but the hedgerows. So like a hedgerow can be quite regular, especially if you do laid hedge management, where you cut the tree and you lay them down on top of each other, like in England in particular. But these are a bit more wild zones, but they still require a lot of additional work. And I think the last thing about this slide about between fields is that these systems offer a lot of wildlife corridor creation and other kinds of beneficial connectivity and networking in your fields, but also then regionally in your part of Finland. So we start to look at these as the linking bits. They're not like the working bits, even though they're doing a lot of work. We just can't measure that work very easily or cheaply, the same way you can measure your yield from a combine. But when you have these on the edges of fields and they're purposely planned, you can start to link up different habitats that may have struggled in a monoculture kind of scenario to really get to one another without causing problems along the way. You're creating more food, more habitat for wildlife and for beneficials. And then with good management of the game, with moose, deer, and hares, and in some places rabbits, I guess, and some of these other animals, with good management of the whole ecosystem, then you reduce some of the pressure on the crops because there's more for them to eat, and then you're also managing their population a bit more closely. So between fields, really great for ecosystem services. Doesn't mean that you can't put in production systems along the riparian zone, but it does mean that management is going to be very different. For example, if you wanted to have there's a wet zone at the bottom of your field, there's a stream there, so a stream being some place where water is flowing perennially, generally doesn't dry up unless there's a very severe drought. There's a lot of water, high water table, and you would like to do something there to increase the habitat but also get some money. Well, maybe you think about black elderberry. Maybe there are a few other species of trees and shrubs that like a lot of water that you could put into that situation, and then also don't require a lot of nutrition, because you don't want to be fertilizing that except very carefully and very precisely, because there's such a large chance it's going to get into the water. So if the main function is to protect that water resource, then you need to have your production aims in line with that first goal. So that goes back to step one: why agroforestry? Why do you want to do this? What are you trying to achieve on your farm? And then what are you trying to achieve with that specific agroforestry practice? And making sure that you really know what your priorities are. So if you don't know what your priorities are, you might go down the wrong pathway. Set your priorities. They're the gatekeepers for determining how you're going to manage the systems going forward. Let's get into some common guidelines. So this is what I called in the roadmap slideshow high-level patterns. That doesn't really say very much. So what's a high-level pattern? That's something where you don't need to know the specific details of a situation, and you can apply something to your context that can help you immediately determine whether or not the whole idea is appropriate. So let's just go through these three, and that should become more apparent. The easiest one for it to become apparent with is actually the first one: access and machinery. So at the top, we've got the tractor out, one of the tractors at the Lilnagel site a couple years ago, and we're spraying. Well, what are we spraying? You don't need to know. We're talking about high-level patterns. Who cares what we're spraying? It's legal what we're spraying, let's just put it that way. But that tractor's boom sprayer is actually, if you've got a keen eye, you can see it's not actually all the way deployed. It's not folded out all the way. That's a 15 meter wide boom sprayer, which we've tucked in the very tips, and we're not actively using those. You can see that there on the right. And so that allowed us to use that one sprayer on our alleys. But what you generally want to do is plan your agroforestry systems with two things in mind. The first is, what kind of equipment do you already have and use? And what are the relationships between those? We'll get to that. There's a slide on access and machinery. And then the other one is what kind of machines do you plan to have in the future. You don't want to do this. All right, we have an older 12 meter, sorry, it's a 10 meter boom sprayer that we need to get some parts for, and that'll be dedicated to this project. But if you're doing this for your farm, you don't want to be making micro adjustments to your equipment. So if we have a 15 meter wide boom sprayer, and that's our biggest piece of equipment, we need to know what the operating parameters are of that boom sprayer. How much room and leeway does the operator need to have in order to work efficiently in a field? So 15 meters becomes one of your key numbers to start building some guidelines around in terms of how wide does the field need to be in order to get actually some trees in there, at what multiples of the use of these bits of equipment. So these are high level patterns. You don't really even need to know what it is you're growing, what kind of trees yet, what kind of crops are growing between the trees. All you need to know is that this is how you work on your farm. And so now we can already start to ditch certain fields, not literally, but figuratively, throw them out the window and say, you're not a good candidate site. Because we just can't get in with the equipment, barely get in as it is. We don't need any trees. So we can rule sites out, and then we can also use that to rule sites in by saying, wow, we could actually use this field and break it up a bit and put some trees in here, for example. The other two high-level patterns that we're going to look at are sunlight and integration. And integration meaning trees with the existing enterprises and the way you like to do business. And then the third one is looking at soil health, or perhaps the lack thereof. Now, access machinery, we have already talked about this. I babbled on in the last slide about that. You've got one of the other boom sprayers. I think that's actually the 10 meter wide one. And you can see we attached a few sticks to the end with some tape there, just to drive around. It sounds wild, but I'm somebody who really needs to reify ideas, bring them into practice in order to understand them. So before we planted a single tree, before we tilled a single tree line, but after we knew this was the candidate site, we were still tweaking the design a little bit. We brought a tractor out, bought the boom sprayer, and we drove around the field a few times, the edges in particular, but also back and forth to get a feel for, well, what is it going to be like to operate the boom sprayer in here? Do we really have the space that we've measured using these GIS tools? And that's a good way to ground truth your ideas, okay? So we really wanted to get in there was ground truthing. And what we had done actually was use some spray paint and marked out where the design was going to go. And then somebody, myself, was following along as Ricard was driving around his tractor with his boom sprayer on there. Like, okay, that's a little tight. How is it to turn? Are we going to have to fold one of those booms up? So that's something you can do if you're not comfortable, trusting in the digital design tools that we're using. And actually, I recommend that to everybody, even if you're totally confident in the design online, using the GIS information and getting everything dialed in. Really, like, you're only going to want to plant this stuff once, so make sure that what you have is going to work. So that's a long-winded way to talk about what's in the text on the top. The tip there is use the working width of that widest implement as the least common denominator. So what that means there is you're going to start dividing, that least common denominator, the boom sprayer typically, into your other bits of equipment. Those other bits of equipment are everything from cultivation tools, right? Seeders, drills, whatever word you want to use to talk about the machine you use to plant with. Your boom sprayer is probably going to come out at some point during the growing season. We're talking about grain or whatever it is here. Even in another situation, maybe you have a combine harvester, okay? So you got how are you going to get the crop out? So what's the working width and also the length of that machinery? So you need to start, going through your inventory. How large of a working space do I have? Many of you already know this, how much space you need to do certain things with the different implements. And this is a puzzle that you need to put together to determine how big the headlands are going to be. So in the image on the bottom, in the green, I've got this we have a 16-meter margin at the end of each alley now, so that when you bring in the combine or the drill behind a larger tractor, that there's room for that machine to move back and forth. And that's a high level pattern. Like, you already have that equipment, so you can already determine how much space you feel you need to have. And we're going to talk about it a bit more in the other little lectures, maybe how you would determine that. You can already figure this out. And so if I need, say, 16 meters on either end of an agroforestry alley, that's 32 meters put together. So if I have 32 meters in one direction to work with, to put alleys running this way, or maybe I could put it like this, run them down my fingers. If I only have 32 meters, how much space do I need to actually justify having a field here? I've subtracted 32 meters from either end of my agroforestry system. In between will be the trees, and then this is the driving space. What makes sense now? Is it 132 meters? Do I need to find fields that are 132 meters? We're going to look at that. So these are high level patterns. And the last thing about this image here is to break down some of the working widths and what that looks like in an alley. So the alley is 12 meters across. We could divide that into two 6-meter wide sections. So if you have a 3 meter, if 3 meters is your working width, say for a planter or something, you could get that down twice and have two different crops perhaps growing in 6-meter strips. If you've got 4 meter wide, well, 12 divided by 4 is 3. So now we have 3 strips. And then lastly, there's the 4 by 3 meter strip there at the far end. So those are the ways that we could plant. We could plant the whole thing, we could plant half of the thing, a third, or a quarter. And so we have a little bit of variability in here, even at a very narrow, intentionally narrow alley width of 12 meters. Generally, we don't recommend 12. 12 is for this pilot project's purposes, which is a different lecture. So that's just how we're looking at it there, that your margins and your alleys don't necessarily need to be the same if you get towards the narrow end of the spectrum. And if you get to the wider end of the spectrum, more than likely your margins are going to be less wide than your alleys, because most of the time your alleys are going to be much bigger than 12. Probably 24 is as narrow as I would like anyone to go, somewhere around that range. So access to machinery, you've got to be able to get to it, you've got to be able to work it, and you already have ways, because you have a farm, you already work your farm. So we can use that as a filter, as a high level pattern to say this is an appropriate place, this is an inappropriate place, because it's just going to get too tight or we can't really get into it anymore. So that's access to machinery. Sunlight and integration. Everybody always says, oh, what about the shade? Aren't you going to have too much shade to grow anything? Well, depending on how big you let the trees get, which is not usually what we want to do. We want to plan the species so we know how big they're going to get. Yeah, they're going to cast shade, even if they're small. So we need to have some working rules of thumb, once again, these common guidelines. So tip number 1, if you want to preserve full sun, right? So if the main thing that you're doing right now requires full sun and you're not interested in changing the main enterprise, you want to preserve its integrity or support its development, and you don't want to start shading that very much, taller trees, which I'm just going to class as like 20 meters or larger. So it's a pretty big tree. 30 meters or so is generally how big the biggest trees are getting in Finland. You need at least 40 meters from the center of that crown, preferably the edge of the canopy, to your production field. whether that is, in this case, I've got a set of, winter, spring, summer, and fall photos from my old farm, which is surrounded by large trees. That's why I took it. And you can see the length of the shadows of different seasons, different times of the year. And actually, it's funny, it looks like in autumn there are no shadows just because it was so dark, there was no sun, so there were basically no shadows. I had to work around that. I couldn't cut down every tree and have a lot of trees that are 15, 20, 25 meters tall. So when I had my separate field blocks, I needed to arrange my crop rotation and my crop planning according to the sunlight distribution. So we're going to help you do that, but think generally, if you really want to preserve your sun-loving crops, 40 meters is what you need to large trees. So you can imagine, though, that if you have a large tree that's 20 meters tall, and you need, my other arm now is 40 meters, you actually create this gradient here where you can bring smaller trees and shrubs closer to the actual production. Now, how close you get, again, you're going to have to tie that in to the rest of these guidelines, access and machinery, what your goals are. But generally speaking, you're going to want, at least from the trunk of a tree that you're integrating into your system, you're going to want a full working width of some kind of management tool like a flail mower or a brush cutter or something like this, so that you can maintain those edges and keep the two relatively separate. So you've got, if you're mechanized, you're really always going to be locked into your management tools and how large those pieces of equipment are. If you're on a small scale like this, where you're doing things by hand mostly, then of course you can bring things a lot closer because you don't need as much space. But my general recommendation is that you're keeping a clear zone of 2 to 3 meters wide, which is almost, at the end of the day, the same size as some of the smaller bits of equipment. And that's kind of a slug barrier, airflow, a little bit to do with sunlight, a little bit to do with root systems, and also just to keep you from getting too cramped. So the last tip here, as a common guideline, there are more. Calculate your shade based on early April or early October. They're slightly different, right? So, midsummer is the end of June. So if we want to go from the end of June to end of October, we have July, August, September. So that's 3 to 4 months. So if you take 3 to 4 months off the other way from midsummer, you're in February. So the height of the trees and the shadow that they cast between April dates and October dates is very, very different. But you have to think about what your goals are and what your production system is. So for me, personally, I want to calculate the dates based on October because I would like to have the longest growing season possible. So, when you're about 4 months away from midsummer, in October, the shadows are quite long, as opposed to, April's only a couple months. So you've got a little short time in the spring and then a longer time in the autumn. But I want to maximize. So if I make sure I have enough sunlight until October, then I'm going to get sunlight already, in March and February, right? So I want the widest window. But if I can't get that, what's the next sort of, main marker that, okay, now I really need to make sure I have enough sunlight? Calculate for April. Depends again on what you're trying to do, what you're trying to grow. Vegetables have a huge diversity, even in Finland, what we can grow. Some of those will be fine with partial shade, and other ones won't. Okay, and then in a field cropping scenario, you're mostly sun-loving grasses with cereals or something like this. So you're going to be wanting to look at that October dates. But if you have flexibility in your system and it's maybe a perennial system, April and October, calculating where the shade is on existing now and where it will be, with your design. So sunlight and integration, you really want to think about that because, yeah, you can't grow anything if you don't have the energy for it. Lastly, soil health. And I'll just go back real quick. So the inset image there with the garlic, we're looking at This is a really nice sized bulb garlic, and look at those roots. Look how strong those roots are. You don't get that with garlic if I plant those in the shade. Um, they're more on the full sun end of the spectrum, right? So, what are you already doing? What do you want to grow? Where could it plausibly grow? You really have to understand the role of energy. Lastly, soil health. We're almost done with this part of the lecture and tutorial. Look, there are a lot of different trees and shrubs that live in Finland. I have a good slide that I got from a forestry workshop showing all these different tree species and shrub species in Finland and populations of each. And it's mostly pine and spruce in Finland, but there's a lot of other things that we could grow. And a lot of those other things that aren't represented well in Finland right now could fit in agroforestry systems. But that doesn't mean that they prefer all, whatever soil you have. You need to match the soil type, the elevation of that soil above a water table, so how wet the soil is. So you can have the same soil type in a dry place, and you have the same soil type in a wet place. Different tree species are going to prefer one over the other, most likely. Some are generalists, but they'll have a preferred habitat. And then you have not just the type, what's the class of this, but what's its actual, fertility level. Is it healthy soil? Is it aggregated? So that image there, that's not really aggregates yet. That's mostly the effect of earthworms and cover crops on some horse manure compost that got worked into the soil more than I, at the time of working it in, would have wanted to, but it's now created aggregates and pore space. Oxygen, air is flowing through that soil, and that's increasing the soil life and the mineralization, as well as the provision of organic forms of nutrients to my plants. Does your soil look like that, or is it brick? So we started, most of our field is still a brick. Match your candidate site to soil health. Best foot forward. We, in our project, we're using agroforestry and agroecological processes to restore soil fertility on degraded agricultural land. That's very different from what many of you are trying to do. Many of you are not being supported with development money. You're farming, you receive some subsidies, but it's a business and it needs to work. So I don't recommend, and most regenerative agriculture practitioners don't recommend, starting in your worst field. If you have the resources and you should do something in your poorest field, by all means go for it. But if you really want to start accelerating positive change on the farm or in your operation, you need to choose sites where things are generally working and accelerate the benefits. Again, some of that goes back to this ecosystem service idea and having service radiuses or coverage from there. If you start to build positive relationships that are increasing in their resilience and ability to provide for the farm, that is going to have outward radiating positive effects on the rest of the system. If you start in a place that's super degraded and you have to struggle and invest a lot of resources into making it work, you're not going to have these beneficial cascading of effects for a long time. So your soil health, you need to understand that. And if you don't have soil analyses from a laboratory that you trust and that you like to work with for all of your candidate sites, this is where these regenerative practices are really important, about learning about what healthy soil looks like. If when I talked about this image on the top, your mind, or maybe it's too small of a picture, but if you didn't really know what you're looking at of why I included that in soil health, if you don't know what soil aggregates are, if you don't know how they're formed, maintained, and deepened through the soil profile, these are things you can learn in an afternoon. It doesn't take a degree in soil science to understand what dysfunctional soil looks like when you dig a hole in the ground and what functional soil looks like when you dig a hole in the ground. And also other proxy indicators of that, such as in the bottom, we've got an image of some decomposer fungi working on some wood chips and compost and oak leaf litter. This is from the United States, from a forest garden that I started, more than a decade ago before I came here. I think there's even an earthworm, maybe. on one of those leaves. But anyways, you can, without even using a shovel, which you should, but if you don't use a shovel, there are other ways you can start to tell whether or not the soil is working. You could just even go out with your water bottle and figure it out. But there are more rigorous ways of testing the soil using a shovel and a water bottle than just pouring water on the ground and seeing what happens. You can use your stopwatch and things like this. So we can help. I can help you with that too. It's not the main target of this, but again, if I want you to be successful with agroforestry, then I need to help you select sites where we think that the species and this system you design is going to work. They don't perform miracles, right? We're not asking the system to, magically convert degraded soils into thriving agroecosystems that are, producing a 1.2 land equivalency ratio of production for your farm, and it doesn't just happen. If it's going to happen, if you're going to get 5, 10, 20% more production from the same land unit area by stacking agroforestry into your system, then you only get the better end of the spectrum when you do this work, when you use the common guidelines and you understand the system as well as you can. So let's look at what the last slide is. What are these next steps? In-field selection notes, between field selection notes. I'm going to start recording those today. If I don't get them done today, then I'll just put this lecture up by itself and then I'll tack on those other ones. Once you have selected a candidate site, or more than one, then we're going to kind of switch back into what we were doing before this lecture. And what we were doing before this lecture was these specific analyses of different kinds of locations in different spatial scales. So we'll look at each candidate site from a multiple set of lenses. You don't have to do all. I think I've got about 7 different ones you can use. Okay, some are more powerful than others to determine whether or not you think it's going to work. Landform, access, water, soil. Some of these first 4 are probably all you actually really need to do to determine which one you want to move into step F, pattern level design of actual agroforestry systems. So before you actually get into agroforestry systems, we need to do a little bit more analysis and measure in some ways that we can understand, that we can comprehend why one location is better or preferable to another to graduate into the next part of the case study creation. So without further ado, thank you. That's the end of this lecture about candidate site location. I hope that I was able to give you a bit more information on things that you maybe had in your mind before we get into tutorials using software in particular, and hopefully your notes. I have, well, it's covered now, but I have a copy of that workbook. We're going to be using those notes then too about candidate site location. Lastly, do stay in touch. Spring will be here sooner than any of us will imagine, I think. So if you would like to organize a one-on-one meeting with me at this point in time digitally, please reach out and do so. In the spring, once the snow's gone and there's something to really sink our teeth into, then I'm happy to come visit you guys again this spring, this summer, this fall, at your own pace to see how we're progressing with agroforestry case study creation on your farm. But for now, digital. Later, when I can see your farm and you're farming, I'd love to come out in the summer. So thanks, and you'll see me again soon, prattling on about the 6 agroforestry practices. Until then.